Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the US State Department says that it has the tools to respond to ceasefire violations in Sudan and will not hesitate to use them. Battle-scarred Khartoum is relatively quiet amidst the latest truce, but there are still reports of limited airstrikes. And a Senegalese court rejects calls for another adjournment in the rape trial of opposition leader Ousmane Sonko. He denies the charges and says that the accusations have been cooked up to torpedo his chances in next year's elections. And Measures of Men is a movie by a German filmmaker focused on the first genocide of the 20th century, in which tens of thousands of indigenous Nama and Herero were slaughtered by German soldiers in modern-day Namibia. The film is a bid to confront viewers with the harsh realities of colonial violence. But first, Khartoum was quieter on Tuesday of Sudan's sixth week of war. There were still reports of sporadic shelling despite a US and Saudi brokered and monitored ceasefire, but overall the intensity of fighting between the army and paramilitary RSF forces has lessened. The US State Department said that it has the tools to respond to ceasefire violations and will not hesitate to do so. The week-long truce is meant to allow more humanitarian aid in. More people will also be able to flee. The Red Cross has warned that refugees are heading into Chad so quickly that there isn't time to safely relocate them before the rainy season starts. Our Bastien Renouy tells us more.
Right after the beginning of this new ceasefire, Khartoum residents were reporting explosions and gunshots. But it seems that the situation slowly improved during the day. Most of my contacts in the Sudanese capital said that they could hear less explosions than during the previous days, that they could still hear sporadic gunfire. So even if the situation is improving in the capital, the fighting continues despite this new ceasefire agreement. But if the situation is improving in Khartoum, it doesn't mean that the fighting stopped everywhere else. In the city of El Obeid in North Kordofan, the rapid support forces are still surrounding the city and locals were reporting clashes today. In Darfur, it's very difficult at the moment to get information because most of the telecommunications infrastructures have been destroyed during the clashes. It seems that in the city of Niala, located in eastern Darfur, rapid support forces and Sudanese military were clashing today in the outskirts of the city. And in the city of El Janina in West Darfur, a few kilometers from the border with Chad, it seems that the rapid support forces are still surrounding the city, but it's impossible to get more news from the civilians stranded in this city as they cannot communicate because of network issues. What we know for sure is that as the war continues, the situation for civilians is deteriorating. It's getting more and more urgent to bring humanitarian assistance in Khartoum, in North Kordofan, in Darfur. Many people are still stranded in their apartments, in their houses. Many do not have access to food, to water, or to electricity. And that was the purpose of this new ceasefire agreement. It was supposed to allow humanitarians to reach these areas. But as the war continues, it's still very difficult for these international NGOs and agencies to reach these places.
Regional correspondent Bastien Renouy there. Now, thousands protested in Tigray in Ethiopia on Tuesday, calling for those displaced within the northern region to return home. It was at the centre of 2 years of civil war that ended in a truce last November. Hundreds of thousands died in battling between federal forces and their allies and Tigrayan fighters, but tensions remain. Forces from the neighbouring Amhara region still control parts of western Tigray, and some of Tuesday's demonstrators say that many are still being prevented from going back to their original communities. And there was tight security around the Dakar courthouse where the rape trial of the main opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko, was held on Tuesday. Sonko was a no-show and has denied the charges, saying that they've been cooked up to scuttle his political career ahead of next year's presidential election. Now, Sam Bradpeace tells us more.
This was the first time that the alleged victim, a young woman called Ajisa, testified in front of the tribunal here in Dakar. She described in quite vivid detail a number of occasions on which she said she was raped by the main Senegalese opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko. The audience sitting in on the tribunal were audibly shocked by some of the details. Mr. Sonko, meanwhile, didn't actually come to court today, and his lawyers say that they wanted the hearing to be postponed because they say their client never actually received an official summons.
If the conditions are correct for him to come to trial, he will come to trial. But if the justice system operates like this, then you should see and reflect on the fact that it is a parody of a justice system.
This was the first of what will be many hearings before we get a decision on this case. Should Mr. Sonko be found guilty, he will almost certainly be unable to take part in next year's presidential election.
Well, it's going to be harder for Nigerian students heading to the UK to take their families with them. New measures have been brought in that only allow students on postgraduate research programs to bring their dependents with them. The number of student visas granted to international students, particularly for Nigerians, has shot up since Brexit and the UK's exit from the European Union. Rhetoric about immigration figures in Britain has grown increasingly tense. The head of the African Development Bank has called out richer countries for not honouring pledges to get at least $100 billion a year to developing nations to help them tackle the fallout from climate change. Africa is at most risk from global warming, despite being the lowest emitter of greenhouse gases. Our correspondent in Egypt sent us this report.
This treatment plant, the largest of its kind in Africa and the Middle East, treats 2.5 million cubic meters of wastewater per day. With this station located in Jabal Asfar, north of Cairo, the Egyptian state treats the wastewater of more than half of the 20 million inhabitants of the country's capital. The French Development Agency is contributing to its expansion.
In Egypt, water resources are already scarce, and they will become even scarcer. This treated wastewater can be used in a totally safe way to irrigate agricultural production, which will then be used for food.
These environmental projects are costly and suffer from a reputation of being unprofitable. This major Egyptian bank wants to debunk this received idea. It borrowed $100 million from a subsidiary of the World Bank. These green bonds finance private sector projects.
So we decided we need to innovate as a financial institution and make sure that investing in agriculture, in water, in resilience projects is profitable. We cannot depend on public funding.
In the world of climate finance, some so-called adaptation projects, such as the Jabal Asfar wastewater treatment plant, designed to cope with the effects of climate change, are even more difficult to finance than so-called mitigation projects, which aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
The financial viability and business potential for the mitigation and energy efficiency investments and renewable energy investment is much more matured compared to the adaptation, and much more bankable, by the way. You are currently seeing the Egypt plan to boom the green hydrogen industries, the energy efficiency industry, the renewable energy industry, but the majority of the investments will be allocated for the mitigation, not the adaptation.
According to the government, Egypt, one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, needs $250 billion by 2050 to deal with the consequences of global warming.
The first genocide of the 20th century has inspired a movie by a German filmmaker exploring a dark and too often overlooked part of his country's colonial history. Between 1904 and 1908, German soldiers exterminated at least 100,000 Herero and at least 10,000 Nama in what's today known as Namibia. Our correspondents went to meet director Lars Kraumer.
This is the story of the first genocide of the 20th century. The film tells the tale of a young German ethnologist studying indigenous peoples in Namibia and collecting their skulls for scientific experiments. Meanwhile, colonial troops are unleashing a massacre on the Herero and Nama peoples. Measures of Men, directed by Lars Kraumer, depicts the crimes of the former German colonial power. With his film, the director wants Germans to face their historical responsibility.
Germany suffers from a true collective amnesia. People either don't know or pretend not to know that Germany was a colonial power. This film aims to convey this history to the general public, who have not yet questioned the issue of ethnological collections and restitutions.
Colonial crimes and the genocide, which took at least 70,000 lives between 1904 and 1908, remain largely unknown to the German public. In Berlin, only a commemorative plaque reminds people of the horrors of colonialism, but it was placed in a military cemetery at the foot of a monument paying tribute to colonial troops. Sad but not surprising, says Israel Konatieke, a Herero living in Berlin for over 40 years.
For me, this plaque is a disgrace. The stone is big, the plaque is at the bottom. It clearly shows how this society still perceives things.
In 2021, Germany officially recognized the genocide and offered over €1 billion in development aid. But for Israel Konatieke and activists for the rights of the Herero and Nama peoples, it is far from enough.
We want apologies, recognition of the genocide and reparations for what we've lost, including the theft of our land.
Many people are still unaware of all of this, but things are starting to change, and that's why the German government should change its current stance and say, yes, we acknowledge international law and we will negotiate directly with the descendants of the victims.
The Namibian government now wants to renegotiate the genocide agreement reached with Germany in 2021, but the government says it won't.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Till then, take care.
Under Turkish dominance, Northern Cyprus universities draw over 50,000 students from across the world, representing a very lucrative market. But the system is exploited by agents who promise dream schemes to attract clients.
They lie for monetary gains.
False promises including easy housing, low cost of living, abundance of jobs, and even a passage into Europe.
I don't think this island will be very, very hard like this. I thought this island would be bed of roses, like others saying.
Stuck with nowhere to go, without contacts or money, the dream quickly turns to a nightmare. France 24 observers bring you reporters in Northern Cyprus on France 24 and France24.com. Africa News, your eyes on Africa. Bringing you the latest from across the continent.
Eye on Africa, presented by Georgia Calvin-Smith on France 24 and France24.com.